And in this model, the settler people evolve into a new nation. You have a new nation forming in which all classes are represented. And you have this in the United States, you have it in Australia, you have it in New Zealand. Look around, there are many examples of this. And Zionist colonization belongs to this latter model. In other words, quite consciously in this case, it didn't happen consciously in all cases of this model, but in the case of Zionism it happened in a very planned and deliberate way. The indigenous people were to be ethnically cleansed and not used as a source of labor. Okay? And what actually happened was the formation of a new nation which is often referred to as the Israeli Jews. I prefer the term Hebrews, which is also sometimes used. I think it's clearer because it doesn't have a religious connotation, and because it focuses on one of the attributes that is unique to this nation, namely use of the Hebrew language as an everyday language of discourse and secular use. Ironically, the Zionist movement that actually, as it were, produced this nation denies its existence, because according to Zionist ideology, all the Jews around the world constitute a nation, and the Holy Land is their ancient homeland, and the Israeli Jews are just part of that nation who happen to have been the vanguard of the whole nation in returning to their ancient homeland. This is a myth, of course. But this myth in Zionist ideology leads to a denial of the existence of a real actual new nation that was formed as a result of Zionist colonization. Okay, now if you look at the fate of decolonization, keeping in mind the distinction between the two models, you see something very striking. In all cases of exploitative colonization, decolonization was not only possible, but has actually taken place. Finished. South Africa is the last example of this. Okay? And it didn't take a socialist revolution to achieve this. It was feasible within existing capitalism. On the other hand, correct me if I'm wrong, put the case of Palestine aside, in all other cases of exclusionary colonialism, where the indigenous population was not used as labor power, decolonization has not taken place. Not only has it not taken place, it is not even on the agenda. In the following sense, I mean, the indigenous people in North America or in Australia, those who remain, overwhelmed by the settlers, but they do fight for equal rights. They do fight for their human rights. They do fight for the possibility, for the ability to develop their ancient language and culture and so on. The struggle is ongoing. I mean, look, in Australia, it's an outstanding example. It's still on. But one thing is not on the agenda, and that is for these indigenous people to reclaim their ancient homeland. There is no national liberation. It is not really something that is on. In fact, in none of these cases, to my knowledge, do you have what you have in the case of Palestine, not one nation forming, that is of the settlers, but actually two new nations forming. Two quite distinct and well-defined national groups. Not only the settler national group, the Hebrew nation, but also the Palestinian national entity. And that is also something that has evolved as a direct result of Zionist colonization. It's not something that existed previously. And I want to make it clear, you see, here is where socialist analysis differs from nationalist ideology. In nationalist ideology, there is a myth of an ancient homeland that has always existed, and an ancient, long existing national entity that needs to be liberated and so on. Actually, if you look closely at these things, they are mostly myths. And in fact, the reality is quite different. As a matter of fact, and a very important ingredient is the fetishization of the real estate that is known as the homeland, the national territory, which is sort of holy, sacred real estate. Now this is clearly visible in Zionism. I mean, in the case of Zionism, you don't. I mean, it's often said you don't have to believe in God to be a Zionist, but you do have to believe that God promised the Holy Land to the Jews. This you do have to believe. But it's also true. I mean, you hear Palestinian nationalists talk about historical Palestine. Now, this historical Palestine is a myth. As a matter of fact, Palestine is an imperialist invention. It is very recent, and it existed for a very short historical period. Until the First World War, there was no such thing as Palestine as far as the people of the region were concerned. There was the Holy Land, which was spoken about by both Christians and Jews. The Holy Land. Palestine was a term used in Europe. It was not used in the Middle East. There was not even an administrative district called Palestine. In the Ottoman Empire, which existed until the First World War, there was no administrative unit called Palestine. There was a country called Syria, which was composed of what is today Syria, Lebanon, Israel, the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and Jordan, the Kingdom of Jordan. All these were part of the country called Syria. Sometimes referred to as Greater Syria, to distinguish it from the Syria that was created by the imperialists after the First World War. And what became Palestine was actually composed of three administrative districts, which were two of them were part of the governorate of Beirut, and the other one was directly under the court, the imperial court in Istanbul, the district of the southern part of what became Palestine. Palestine was created by the imperialist powers, specifically Britain and France, in their carving up of the possessions of the Ottoman Empire following the First World War. And I haven't got the time to go into the minute history of this, but I mean that this process ended. First of all, Syria was divided into two big parts. The northern part to be mandated to France, and the southern part to Britain. The southern part was Palestine, but then this Palestine was divided further, and the eastern part, which was by far territorially the larger part, became the Emirate or Principality of Transjordan, which is today the Kingdom of Jordan. And historical Palestine, so-called, existed for 25 or 26 years. Between, well, I mean, the starting date depends where you start, when it was actually created, or when Churchill, who was colonial secretary at the time, actually gave it the official recognition with the blessing of the League of Nations, which was 1923, and it existed, all right, so from 1922 or 1923 until 1948. That's all. Before that, if you are an inhabitant of Nablus, for example, what are you? Well, you would say, you know, I'm a Muslim, or I'm a Nabulsi, I'm an inhabitant of Nablus. Yeah, but what country do you inhabit? It will not even occur to him or her to say I'm Palestinian, because the concept didn't exist. By the way, the country doesn't have an Arabic name. Palestine is just an Arabization of Palestine, a Latin. There is no Arab country that does not have an Arab name except Palestine. So it was an imperialist creation, and it was created specifically for the purpose of Zionist colonization. In the League of Nations mandate, giving Britain rule over Palestine, the Balfour Declaration, which started in this university, Chaim Weizmann, the instigator of the Balfour Declaration, the guy who actually got it from Balfour, was a chemist in Manchester University during the First World War. So it's somehow appropriate to making this analysis here. So the Balfour Declaration, which was the sort of charter that the British imperialism gave to Zionist colonization, was quoted verbatim. Okay, now there is something, as I said, returning to, there is something exceptional in the case of this colonial conflict, and that is that the indigenous people was not completely overwhelmed and pulverized or completely exterminated, as happened in other cases where the indigenous people were not exterminated, were not used as labor power, but formed itself into a national entity. And this has, in my view, much to do with the fact that the Palestinian people are not a group of people with a separate language and separate culture unique to them and distinct from all. I think if the Palestinians were a group like some Indian tribes or some Australian tribes with their own unique language and culture and so on, they probably would have long been obliterated. But the specific case here is that the Palestinian people is part of a larger national formation whose unification was arrested precisely by the division of the Turkish Empire following the First World War. Part of the purpose of this division was to deny the possibility of the Arab nation uniting, as happened in Germany, as happened, well, it was only finally happened in our days, but as happened in Italy before, and as Britain in fact promised to the its Arab supporters in the rebellion during the First World War, when it solicited support from the Arab movement against the Turkish Empire, was promised then, we'll support the creation of an Arab state in the